G'day and welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I want to do a video on shot angle or your cosine. So shooting up or down over ELR distances or ELR shooting. I suppose I'll go through the fundamentals of shooting at angles. Like I said, shooting up or shooting down. There is, in the way of using apps or using tables, it all makes sense and that sort of stuff. But largely what we're talking about is the angle of your shot, whether it's flat, or it's shooting down, or it's shooting up. And this is the angle we're talking about, whether it's vertical, you're going up to 5 degrees or 10 degrees or 15 degrees or 45 degrees or 90 degrees, and the same in the way of down. So a negative angle is shooting down. I suppose that the fundamentals of what you need to understand is how this affects a shot in a general purpose. Much more, by the way, at a 20-yard shot and a 50-yard shot and a 200-yard shot and a 600-yard shot and even to a 1,000-yard shot in rare instances where you'll have enough elevation to create that angle. But much more in the close range stuff is where it's really much more something that we talk about. What it actually is about is that when a bullet leaves a barrel and travels forward, it's the time in the air and the distance it travels across the earth that creates the amount of downward movement on the bullet. So it actually has to travel sideways. Going across here is where it's actually dealing with the gravity or the effect of gravity versus the shot. Once you go into pointing straight up and down, it really almost doesn't. It does, but the percentage it does because of the constant speed of gravity versus the speed of a bullet is very, very small versus the area we're talking about. So what that simply means, without getting complicated about shooting straight up and straight down, in any real sense of what you can really do, that's a very short distance shot. But when you're talking about, let's say, the difference between shooting at 90 degrees and shooting at 45 degrees to get to the same distance of the shot, this shot is out to this distance, 45 degrees. You'll see that an actual, from the target point, from the shooter point to the horizontal direction is a shorter direction, shorter distance. And that shorter distance is the fundamentals of what it just hasn't had to deal with the same amount of gravity. So for that reason, the bullet doesn't have as much drop. So that's the simple, very, very crude, but very simple way of explaining this. Okay. So when you're shooting at a bird in the air and you've got a safe backdrop, keep that in mind, but you're shooting a bird in the air and it's 45 degrees up and it's 50 yards by the shot in the way of from the muzzle to the bird you're trying to shoot, but it's only travelling across the ground 2/3 of the distance that the length of the shot. That means you have to allow for that much less drop in your bullet. That's the simple bits and pieces of it. Now, without going into explaining that and working that beyond that point, I want to reference to the fact that what I'm talking about here is ELR, so extreme long range. So generally, in most cases, if we talk in normal center fires and that sort of stuff, we're talking over a mile. So long distance shooting. Now, long distance shooting. Now, the fundamentals of that mean that to get any serious angle, you need some really serious height. So if you're shooting at over a mile, and you've only got what seems like a lot, let's say 300 feet, we've only still got a small drop. You've only still got probably around 3 degrees. And the fundamentals of this arc thing, the way of when it affects your shot, is you really have to be over 5 degrees, so over 5 degrees, which is about this angle here, before you see any actual distance, any notable difference in the distance forward traveled. So it means it's very rare. And realistically, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. That doesn't mean it's not mountains where people shoot a mile and get 1,000 or 1,500 feet of elevation in their shot and get into where they're talking about 15 degrees or something like that, where they start to make a difference in the way of the distance travelled. But here's a little key. Here's the bit that makes it different for ELR shooting, and where there's a fundamental change in what goes on. And that is when you have 1,000 feet difference in elevation, you have an air pressure change. And that's the fundamentals of what I'd like to explain here. And for those who don't realise, air pressure is the main thing that the bullet has to fight. That's the friction that slows the bullet down. If there was no air pressure, then bullets don't need to slow down. They can just keep travelling with the same speed. Air pressure is the resistance that's slowing them down. So the less air pressure, the less the bullet slows down. The less the wind affects things, the less of the enemy of a bullet's flight is air. So that means, and I should say they don't fly, they are going simply with momentum and centrifugal spin to keep them travelling. So they don't use air to fly, air is resisting against them. So this affects very much, and this is something if you've shot in different altitudes, or you use your apps, or you figure it all out, is if you shoot at sea level or shoot at 1,000 feet above sea level, like where we shoot, that's fairly hard work for bullets. You tend to need more elevation. Your bullets are going to slow down faster, that sort of thing. If you shoot at 3,000 or 4,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 feet, which some people are shooting at, then you'll find that there's less elevation needed. Wind affects bullets less. It's all a little bit easier on the bullet. It might be starting to get a little bit harder on the lungs, some of those elevations, but that's the fundamentals of how it works. So let's go to an ELR shot. And this is one which changes things quite considerably. When you look at, let's say a 1.5 mile shot, and you're in you've got extremely big mountain you're shooting into, so you've got 2,000 feet of elevation in your shot from the shot you're shooting at. These are very rare conditions, but I'm going to the extremes of what you can do in these situations. Let's go with shooting down to start off with, and the thing that you would think would be an advantage. So you're shooting from 2,000 feet, you're right up on the top of this mountain, 2,000 feet above your target area, 1.5 mile shot. So you end up with where there is enough cosine in there to end up where your elevation that you need for the shot has been reduced. Well, so that's a win, isn't it? Well, the air pressure change is quite a big deal. At this end, at the business end of this shot, so when the bullet has been fighting air pressure all the way through, so it has been getting to a point where it's been slowing down, but there's less angle. Well, the trick is at 2,000 feet lower than where you're shooting, the air pressure has got heavier. So any wind is going to affect the bullet more. The resistance against the bullet is higher. So the little win you got out of shooting downhill, because with the angle you're shooting on, gets counteracted by the extra air pressure you're dealing with down the bottom of that shot. So shooting downhill becomes a negative due to the fact that you've lost you're fighting more air pressure. So the simple thing of the logic of it rolling downhill would make it easier. Yeah, like I said, the up and down is very little effect to it. The shortening in the cosine, so the shortening of the overall distance traveled, is definitely a win, but shooting into higher air pressure is definitely a lose. You actually end up with, when you do the math, you end up with a net loss. Very rare circumstances, like I said. In the opposite side of things, in shooting uphill, you end up with a little bit of a net win. There's still some negatives to it. If you do the same thing, you're going from this air pressure to that air pressure. At the business end of the shot, when you're shooting uphill, the air pressure's backing off. It's getting a little easier. You tend to find, I should say, with the cosine, okay, there's a little wind, a little less air pressure. Yeah, there's a wind. You'll find that there's less elevation needed because you're shooting into lower air pressure and you've got that shorter distance traveled. The negative with shooting into hills quite commonly is the fact the winds are harder to read. So they have a little less effect at lower pressure, but the winds running across the faces of hills and things like that can be harder to read. There can be more stuff going on that side of things. So to be truthful, the simple summation of my conversation is, even in those really rare situations that we're talking about there, things work the opposite way to what you thought they would. You come back to the cosine or your shot angle in close range stuff, and really where it's most effective or most commonly used is in your short range stuff, in your hunting stuff, or in your tactical stuff, in when you're shooting 100 yards but you're shooting down at 45 degrees. Those are places where you really have to understand it, and then doing the research on that, using your apps, using your tables, and understanding how to use your cosine, how to use your angle properly is very, very relevant. But when you're talking ELR, the distances involved, that percentage difference between the distance traveled versus the distance of the height means those angles are very, very low. And as I said with the air pressure thing, it sort of cancels itself out. My simple comment is driven out when people ask, and a little bit the reason for this video. This image behind us, the last video I did, is all shot from a local hill. I don't know its overall height. It's around the 800 feet probably from its base, but it's actually from a valley is where this hill comes up. The shot elevation the biggest shot elevation we have is 400 feet. I think 430 feet, which then where we're shooting at that highest point, we're actually shooting out to a place that is, it is 1,435 feet above sea level, and the place we're shooting to is 1,010 feet above sea level. So it looks a bit higher where you fly back into it because of going across a gradual valley back down into a hill. But the point of it, even if it was flat from there and it was 800 feet, and then all these other things that I was talking about with an ELR shot come into play, especially when you talk about a 2 mile or 3,800 yard shot. So my simple comment generally is that it doesn't affect things in the distance we're talking about. It's less than 5 degrees. We're actually shooting a 3-degree shot. For those 2 to 3 degree shots is our normal sort of shot. So it has no effect because there's no difference in the distance traveled. But there's some more bits and pieces to understand for people who do get to shoot into the mountains or from the mountains in proper mountains, and down into the valley, onto the plain, or from the plain up onto the mountain, have real elevation involved. Then it works a bit the opposite. It actually is a little bit, and I wouldn't say easier, there's a little less bullet work to do to shoot uphill than to shoot downhill in an ELR shot. But I'd go with largely, it doesn't make any difference. Hope that makes some sense. Thanks for checking in on us. I'll catch you next time.